Welcome to the Culture Stew podcast. I'm Maria Morukian.
And I'm Roger Moreano.
In every episode, we will meet with practitioners, authors, and all around fascinating people who share their wisdom and insights on all things related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Roger, thank you so much, as always, for sharing your amazing Rolodex with us, because we get the just such incredible thought leaders. And today's interview with Dr. Ayanna Brown is no different. So she is currently at the Erickson Institute in Chicago. Previously, she was at Elmhurst College and a number of other institutions of higher education. She has her own consultancy called Thought Spectrum, has really been a professional educator focusing on culturally responsive pedagogy and educational practices for her entire career. And I just love the way that she infuses this notion of education, not only when we think about it at the micro level, but also when we think about education more broadly in our society and how we can, really create opportunities for learners at all stages of their lives to continue to do this reflective work and understand some of the systems that are at play that are impacting us both publicly and privately in our lives and our professions. So I know you and Ayanna go way back. Tell us a little bit about your experiences with her and why you thought she would be a great guest to bring on the show.
Yeah, thanks, Maria. Dr. Brown is someone who I've known since about 2008, and we spent time together working at Elmhurst College. I actually taught a course with her there, and she is just a beloved instructor and educator who really brings out the best in her students. Students and colleagues alike really have always raved about how she is authentic. She is deeply committed to the well-being of everyone in her circle and in the work that she engages in. And she is just really motivated to inspire folks to reach students and reach the world of education through deep personal connections and a deep understanding of those who we serve. Part of what she teaches is really that understanding of students as complete human beings, and that we cannot do the work of educators without understanding fully the needs of our students.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Roger, because you could just feel her warmth and her passion through the screen when we were talking with her. So I hope folks take the time to listen and enjoy our conversation with Dr. Ayanna Brown. Welcome, Ayanna. We're so happy to have you on the podcast.
Good afternoon, and thank you for having me.
So first question, just to get a little bit more of your story, Ayanna, what are some messages that you received early in life that have really shaped you and your identity, just how you show up in the world?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think my mom was definitely on a daily mission of message delivering. She was notorious for writing post-it notes and sticking them on the bathroom mirror. There was always something on the table. There was poetry mounted on the walls of the house. There were always messaging about things from attitude to academics to resilience to you better have this done by the time I get home. You know, she was very organized, and written discourse was a tremendous mode of communication. So, but she was always very crafty with clairvoyant slogans. She quoted lyrics from songs, and she could pull them out of the air. It could go from Dolly Parton to Billy Joel and Stevie Wonder to James Brown in a heartbeat. So I think my mom, I was raised by my mom primarily when we moved to California from Buffalo, New York. And as a single parent mom with three girls living in the Bay Area with relatively, no family per se on a regular, daily life basis. So no extended family. We were all we had. So she made sincere efforts to be very clear in her communication. And she would remind us that we were a representation of her. And so we did not own the right to leave the house mismanaging our actions, behaviors, language, because that was a reflection of her. And so, of course, we did stuff, but at the same time, the messages were always very clear about what excellence looked like, what expectations were, and go ahead and try your hand at getting it wrong. And there's mommy right there in the picture behind me. There's mommy. Wrong way. There we go. But it was it was very supportive and loving, but she was always had very high expectations and would remind us that circumstance is not a consequence or is causal to effort. So this might be a circumstance, but that has nothing to do with the expectation of what you should be doing. So, and she made that very clear.
Mm. Well, that helps me understand a lot for sure. And I would say, because of how much I know about you, and it makes a lot of sense in terms of just the grounding that you have and in the upbringing that you had. And I'm curious how that upbringing really helped shape the direction you decided to choose to go into in your career, but specifically in the journey through your higher education at Tuskegee and then moving into Vanderbilt and choosing to decide to get into the world of education and to really study interdisciplinary studies and specifically culturally responsive teaching. I'm curious how that helps shape your path.
Wow, there's so many pieces in there. So, if I go back to my mom and my grandparents, I'm a first generation college graduate. So, my mom, while she attended college for some years and then did not complete, she was very clear about what expectations were. And so, because of our community in our environment, there were very instrumental educators who are very rooted in expectation and not expectation without support, but the sense of communal responsibility. And it's not just about you, but it's about you in the context of community. And so I give a lot of credit to my first through, seventh grade teachers for living in the neighborhood that we went to school in. So it was very easy to ride bikes and it's like, oh, let's stop over at Miss Thomas' house, and ring the doorbell and hey, and she had hugs and kisses and cookies and, or so your teachers were not away from you. So culturally responsiveness was literally my experience growing up in the context of my neighborhood and having that connection. And that seems almost very odd and very strange for many children today who don't necessarily have the teachers who work with them living in their neighborhood and around the corner and running into them in the grocery store and that sort of thing. And so when you have people who drive in, do a job and see it as a job and then drive 40 minutes away, there's no responsibility or relationship to community, and they're not also invested in the same issues that the kids are invested in everyday life. So my experiences were connected to that. And I appreciate that the seminal works of culturally relevant pedagogy is a reflection of my actual neighborhood where I grew up. So that also makes it very clear to me that this wasn't just a scholarship that I picked up. It literally is what I lived. It was what I experienced. So it was an organic fit. And I didn't know it then. It wasn't until I got to graduate school and started studying and studying culturally responsive teaching, and really it was culturally relevant pedagogy. And studying it, I was like, this sounds really familiar. This is really familiar. And as I started thumbing through Gloria Ladson-Billings' work, The Dream Keepers, and reading the appendix, I realized and confirmed that that literally was my school. It was my neighborhood. They were the teachers I had. So this for some people, philosophy, a pedagogical approach, theoretical framework was literally where I grew up. And it was not an intended, it was something a little greater, I would say, than that. Um, so there's a lot of things to that and responsibility that comes with that as well. It didn't necessarily mean I intended to become a teacher either. When I was graduating from high school and entering into Tuskegee University, I was a double major in English and Spanish and definitely had the interest of pursuing law school. And wanted to think about justice in a legal sense, not necessarily social justice in the direct way. But I definitely was feeling politically inclined, right? And as I continued to study, it was pulling at me that the classroom was really where I wanted to be, but still had those foundational beliefs in equity and justice. And what is it in learning processes, not necessarily a bird's eye view of systems, but what does it mean to create those spaces in classrooms for learning? So my career began as a middle school English language arts teacher, rooted in the idea of what does it mean to create a just education for middle school students, much like a bit of the one that I experienced.
Two thoughts that came from what you were just sharing, Ayanna. One is I had this moment of clarity when I was thinking about my own upbringing, being a child of two teachers and being surrounded in my own community by many of the educators in my school district. And yet my parents, we grew up in the suburbs of Detroit, Michigan, and my parents were teachers at Detroit Public Schools. And so there was a very clear racialized line of segregation when it came to who lived in which communities. And it didn't occur to me until just now how removed my parents and many of their friends were from the communities that they were serving, and how that impacted their ability to connect with and understand the needs of their students. It's really, really powerful.
Yeah, it was it's really evident, for example, if there's going to be community events, community celebrations. Juneteenth was huge in my neighborhood.
Mm.
And when people gather and you're at a festival, you're at the park and you're hanging out and you're seeing your teachers with their kids and their families. There's a very strong humanizing element to what happens when, your teachers live lives and they're engaged in the same issues that you're engaged with. So if you are having conversation with City Works about sidewalks, if you're having conversations about drive-by shootings and the issues that are happening in the community, it's not just the issues of the kids, it's the issues of the teachers as well. And so, and not to say those were the bulk of the issues, but the city in which I grew up, which is East Palo Alto, California, is known, if you will, for many, many years. It was identified as having the highest murder per capita rate, and that just ended in 2023. Matter of fact, it was on the news when I was home in the Bay Area that finally there was no murders this year, and that was like a big deal. So in that and being 15 minutes from Stanford, to be clear, so when you talk about the demarcations of access to extreme wealth being literally right next door to extreme working class poverty, and the issues, you have teachers who easily could live in many of what I'm going to call the suburbs, the outlets of Palo Alto. So you've got, Mountain View, Redwood City, Menlo Park. You have all these neighboring places that you can get to very, very quickly on the interstate. But you had very committed teachers who believed in their community, and they weren't just sort of living among the people to make a point. This is where they lived. And so the issues, be it from the concerns about access to groceries or, whatever the issue may have been from a political perspective, it was their issue too. And so that created a oneness, the quality of their education or the quality of the teaching and what they invested in the classroom was not just about a merit raise or some other form of gratuity, as opposed to this is what we need for our kids. And so those pronouns of we and our and my kids, we were their kids, in every sense of the phrasings.
I wanted to go back to this concept of culturally responsive teaching that you mentioned earlier, Ayanna, and how this was just a lived experience for you. It was your existence. And so I wanted to, if you could take a few minutes to describe culturally responsive teaching and how it's evolved over time. thinking about CRT, the other CRT,
Yeah,
right?
right, the other
But
CRP.
yes, if you could, right, right. Tell us a little bit about what CRT is and how it has come to be.
Right. Well, this almost seems like a, totally irresponsible moment to do this, because, there have been critical elements about culturally responsiveness, and I'm just going to use those two words. And what does it mean to engage in relevancy and responsiveness? And there's some interchangeability between the two. That's important. So when Gloria Ladson-Billings first authored this language or coined this language of culturally relevant pedagogy, okay, this is the beginning of this language. This is happening with a shift coming out of multiculturalism, where people were deeply invested in sort of, let's just celebrate people and let's just celebrate kids. And in some ways, probably taking the superficialities of identity and turning them into celebrations, right? And while at the same time, this investment, if you will, from the multicultural education space is leaning very heavily into the celebratory nature of culture. Culture is also being looked at in a very superficial way. It's not necessarily thinking about everyday life. It's not thinking about culture as a lived experience, and it certainly isn't looking at culture with a socio-political responsibility or a lens to what are the social, political, and economic elements of what it means to be. And so in this context, it's also happening. So if you're spinning all of these plates, you also have this interesting what was happening at the time with trying to figure out how come those kids, and overwhelmingly Black and Brown kids, how come they just can't do better in school? Everyone else, and let's just use the model minority myth, all the other non-white people are doing just fine. What's wrong with the Black people? What's wrong with the brown people? And so while Dr. Ladson-Billings never coined culturally relevant pedagogy specifically about Black children, the roots of the research was inspired by the idea of questioning how come we're not seeing achievement shifts with Black children. So culturally relevant pedagogy didn't belong as a pedagogy for Black people, but it was responding to the question of how come Black children aren't doing better in schools. And it's through the pursuit of her scholarship and research that stopped sort of focusing on this achievement gap, which she also talks about many, many years later, the achievement gap versus the achievement debt, where the question starts to shift to not question what's wrong with these kids, but what's right and what's going very well. And why are we not talking about what's going on very well? And who are the people that are doing the work where it is going very, very well? And so the foundational element of cultural relevance was to look at who are these amazing teachers that are really producing the work and doing a great job. They're not in these statistics, and more profoundly, you're not talking about them. And so we can't ignore that there are demarcations that are stark between the achievements of what happens with non-white students, and specifically African American and Latinx students in schools. But we were struggling with a discourse that said there are teachers that are doing amazing jobs. So there was a twofold agenda. We have to lift up and then go, what are they doing? The reason why they're doing so well. Hence, we get to these principles of culturally responsiveness that cut across in her study of looking at excellent teachers of African American children. And so the evolution of this notion of culturally relevance is nested in the idea that these kids are actual people, and they come to school with lives and families and beliefs, and these lived experiences contribute to the way they think. And when these things are included and invested in and made foundational to the learning process, it's not just that you read a story on a particular day or you included a poem, during a particular month, but you really did honor the lived experiences of students, and you gave them a sense of purpose for learning concepts and ideas that allowed their identities to be engaged in that work. And the work was elevated beyond do this for a grade, but do this for a sense of purpose and impact. And it's the impact factor that moves through the rungs of what culturally relevance is. And so this idea of academic achievement is unquestionable. That is the whole point of why we send kids to school. It's the whole point of why they go. But teachers have to not believe that, well, enough of them got it, so let's just keep going. Academic achievement is creating a sense of responsibility as well as a sense of codependency, that I need you to learn and I need you to know that you can. And it's not okay for me to keep going if you didn't, right? And so that codependency of teacher need and desire has to be met also with student. But the question is, why don't students feel connected? Why does it feel like a set of perfunctory, let me just bubble this stuff in so I can go? There's no sense of commitment and investment because they were erased and made invisible from the very ideas. And so many people started thinking about, what does it mean to actually survey your students? What are you interested in? What do you like? What do you do for fun? What's your favorite this? And using those things as a catalyst to embed that into the way in which you connected and taught lessons. And so that's where we get to this idea of cultural competency. And so when we talk about cultural competency, it's about saying, well, there's some things that people will learn to do in school that create skills and competencies toward academic checklists of skills that one has to know. But there are also competencies connected to who people are as cultural beings. And those competencies should not be considered negotiable or erasable, but they should be things that can be invested in. And if teachers don't know who their students are, then they too need to invest in culturally competent work as well. And so excellence for teaching and learning also included understanding these competencies, but also that they are dynamic. And so there's been a host of different types of scholarship to be produced over the last, since 1995 through, 2024, where you have a lot of people who've over invested in cultural competency. And they've talked a lot about developing cultural competency, but that hasn't necessarily included what does it mean to help your kids become more invested in those competencies in a greater way. It's more like teachers, you need to be more competent. So read some books about your kids. Well, kids change, times change, people grow, people change. So cultural competency isn't sort of like, because I read these 10 books, I now am more confident about Mexican Americans. And it's sort of like, yeah, but that was written in the 20th century. Things have changed, they've evolved. So keep
Yes.
going, stay in relationship and be authentic in those relationships. And one area that I really appreciate that I kind of dig into a bit in my own scholarship is that Dr. Latson-Billings specifically talks about how it's often the last tenet of culturally responsiveness that people ignore the most. They're all about this academic achievement piece. They talk a great deal about cultural competency and trying to understand the dynamic nature of culture and what it is, but they completely obfuscate the responsibility of critical consciousness. And what is critical consciousness and sociopolitical responsibility? And so when we're talking about critical consciousness, we're saying you need to know what society is and what society is doing. And if you don't have the critical level of awareness to engage in this academic work in order to disrupt the status quo, then being culturally competent makes you competent enough to be a worker bee. Being culturally competent makes you competent enough to keep things within the order that may not necessarily be working to the best interest toward the liberation of people. And so this is where, no pun intended, where CRP and what becomes culturally relevant teaching, which looks at actual teaching strategies. So that's how CRP, pedagogy, and CRT, culturally relevant teaching, starts to lean very closely to CRT, critical race theory. Because when we start talking about critical consciousness, there's a moment of, hello, where do we live? And learning for what? And I'm going to stay within the home of my raising of culturally relevant pedagogy. where Dr. Ladson Billings is also the seminal scholar, along with Bill Tate, who moves critical race theory from the legal into the education world. So the CRP, CRT is really coming from the same home, if you will, of the same scholars. So
Yeah.
how do I lean in on that? Where do I fall in that? Well,
Yeah.
there's what I know and what I saw as a child growing up in the district that was doing the work. There were teachers who they didn't have a name for it. For them, it was just doing right by these kids, doing right by them. It didn't have a name for it, it was what they believed. And it's not like they all had a meeting and sat down and said, okay, this is how we're all going to do it. They were just doing what it meant, but it has a home, it has a history. And so when we think about the role of education for Black people coming out of enslavement, moving through institutions that were committed to them through historically Black colleges, the pedagogies and the teaching approaches in historically Black colleges and universities are probably the incubators of what we now would call culturally relevant teaching.
Yeah.
Right? It's where this idea of you live in a society that could wish you away. You
Right.
live in a society that believes you are only as good as your labor and your ability to produce for it. Yet, we are going to prepare you not just to work within it, but to work within it and beyond it, so that there can be a shifting in the role of African American people in American society. So for as much as 1995 feels like a very beginning, if you will, for some people in reading about culturally relevant pedagogy, I'm going to reach back a little bit further and say there's a history for Black people in this country of what it means to be educated in spite of what dominant society would have wanted, and what that looks like.
Well, there's so much there. My head is swirling. And I think, this is so important for folks to hear, because so much of what you're talking about, particularly when it comes to teaching, I think you're right. I think there's a willingness for folks to engage in their own professional development and to read and to understand and want to create cultural responsiveness in their teaching. But the critical piece that's missing quite often is, and this is definitely true in educators I've spoken to, who echo what you say, that critical consciousness is often not there, and it requires a real deep investment in one's personal understanding of our society and how it works, but also, even more greatly, a deeper investment in our students and their lives and what complete human beings deal with on a daily basis in these areas and structures that we're in, particularly if these structures are informed by deficit thinking and deficit mindsets, right? That give teachers perspectives or perceptions of their students as not capable. And some of the things that you were sharing a little bit about in terms of looking at rather than looking at what students don't do well, looking at what they do right, and lifting that up is critical. And it actually reminds me of some of the research that was done by Tara Yasso in the mid 2000s on community cultural wealth, and looking at redefining the experiences of students through what is perceived to be a lack of capital to actually identify a significant amount of capital that's there if we look for it, if we inspire it in students. So the aspirational capital, do we have students that want to succeed? Of course we do, right? Are they being asked to achieve even higher goals? Are they told that people believe in them so that aspiration could be manifested? There's linguistic capital, particularly for students that come from dual language families or English as a second language families, to not see their Spanish speaking first as a deficit, but rather as a gift and as a form of wealth of being able to navigate our community and to really move forward. And then on and on with social capital and how to navigate the systems that you're a part of, and what can you bring through your lived experience to lift up your opportunities and lift up your chances for success, being told that we believe in you as a result of what you've experienced and what you go through, right? And so I'm curious how you see all of those dynamics in terms of the challenges educators have now to really meet the evolving and very, very challenging needs that exist today. And what steps can educators take to really fully invest in the full well-being of their students, knowing that there's a lot of aspiration out there if we look for it?
Yeah, so this is a multifaceted question in terms of what does it mean to support teachers, and it also reminds us that we have to remember that teachers are, a part of a workforce that are agents, if you will, of a state, right? You work for the state, okay? You work in your school district, but you work for your state.
Right.
And employed by the state. You're licensed by your state. You're upholding the standards of a state. Okay. So if we understand the position itself is inherently a political one. Now, I don't think many teachers go into their jobs thinking, oh yeah, this is a political job. I think oftentimes people think about, I love teaching, I love kids. I love the joy and the excitement and being creative and bringing opportunities and they sort of lean into that element of the profession. But if we understand the history of the profession and even just the part of what does it mean to become a teacher and that licensing responsibility, you are an agent of the state. And by way of that role, it is inherently connected to your elected officials and the politics of the state. So if we think about what does it mean to be a teacher, then teachers must begin to understand who they are as political people and to engage that as a part of what is necessary when we're talking about advancing the needs of children who are a part of a public education system. And so advocacy for student learning is not isolated to a task of going to the library and finding a really fun book to read with your kids. Advocating for students means understanding what is the political will of where you work at a micro level, meaning your county, to a macro level, meaning your state and state government, and then zone out a little bit more. And you may be looking at your region a little bit more. You're looking at the nation, et cetera. And so supporting teachers means inviting them into a profession with a little bit more clarity and transparency about what does it mean to be engaged in a political job. I think if that element were introduced in teacher education programs, then you wouldn't have so many folks who seem to be a bit sticker shocked that so much of their work is contested or feels challenging. Now, I wouldn't want to do this to deter anyone from pursuing a career as a teacher, but I certainly would want to do this to inspire people to get rid of the phrase and abandon it with a great deal of degree of urgency of I'm just a teacher. If I hear another person use the phrase, I'm just a teacher, I think all of my hair is going to fall out. Okay. If we understand the role and the position and what that means as a political position that is in response to the decision making that you are also a key player in, that facilitates the political responsibility of decision making of what gets taught, what's available, what's accessible, that I think it has a tremendous way of informing how to gain traction with support. We know how to throw support around a political candidate. So what does it mean to throw support around a teacher? A teacher is a political candidate every day. Right? They're engaged in a set of actions and the politics of education, even if they don't know it. So I think there's a great disservice we do in teacher education by not introducing the significance and the seriousness of teaching as a political responsibility. And if you're advocating for the needs of the most disenfranchised, the most dispossessed, the most ignored, the most certainly positioned in a negative way, and those people who are absolutely demoralized because of the institution of education, then you are not only an advocate, but you're a leader of a resistance movement. You are a contemporary version of Harriet Tubman every day. Now, how many white teachers knew that? Because that still remains 80% of your teaching force. So if they had an understanding that your job is deeply connected to those people who are more likely engaged in public education, the statistics of who's teaching the kids and who's enrolling in school don't match. It is the continual cultural mismatch of those statistics. So I think we have to be a little bit more transparent about that responsibility and what that means. Now, that does not then take us to something at a more granular level of saying teachers need to, be supported in articulating what they need help with. A lot of times teachers are invited into the profession and they are given some illusions about how much more you ought to know than your kids, and how much you should never reveal that you don't know something. And that disservices teachers from engaging and building allies with folks where they could say, I'm really struggling with this topic. I never learned this topic. There are far more too many teachers that I prepare who will say, I never learned that information. And so they're coming to courses that I teach and they're like, this is the first time I have ever heard of this thing. And so if teachers are learning things for the first time because of a professional development workshop, there's a great deal of vulnerability that one may have and feeling as if they lack the aptitude. So rather than repudiating or demoralizing teachers for what they don't know, they need to be embraced by a community of folks who can say, it's okay. You are a victim of a system that chose for you to be ignorant. That's not your fault, but you now are accountable. And so being an ally and being supportive, and then handing over a little bit of accountability because to remain ignorant is a choice, right? To be ignorant is a victim. To remain ignorant, that's a choice. And so we have to be honest about that.
There's such a significant identity shift that you're describing in terms of preparing teachers to be political actors. And I wonder where power and positionality comes into that, because having worked with educators as well as with a lot of government agencies, the bureaucracy that exists in both, I think, can sometimes create this sense of learned helplessness, right? That people are so caught up in where they sit within the hierarchy of the bureaucracy. And I've seen it firsthand with, with my own parents as well, sort of like, well, going back to what you said, I'm just a teacher. That is coming from a place of, I don't have power to make the types of that are needed. And I'm wondering, how do you respond to that in the work that you do? How do you call people forth to sort of reframe that notion of where power can exist?
I appreciate you asking this question, because if teachers are reminded of their status as being somewhere at the bottom, right? As it's sort of like, you're the most critically needed employee, but you're the one at the bottom. Then teachers would stop and go, wait a minute, what happens if we don't do it? It really, it's an interesting conundrum, right? When we talk about resistance and being in a city like Chicago. Okay, let's be clear, because we go through these seasons every year of striking, protesting. And every place isn't this sort of galvanized labor union mega force sort of thing. So I think there's a really critical element of what does it mean to be politically engaged, because when you are politically engaged, you understand what does it mean to collaborate. You understand what does it mean to be not just someone who is subordinated, but someone who actually engages in a series of practices where you learn to engage in those conversations at multiple levels. And the more and more we drill down this language of just a teacher, it helps teachers justify why they won't do more than what they literally are told. So you sort of get the product of the power of language. And we know the power of language because it's been used to the disadvantage of every marginalized person in the history of the world. Like, you have to convince people that they are not what they cannot, what they should not, what they will not. and why they cannot. And so this process of building up the fortitude of teachers to engage in being involved in decision making has to do with how we help establish what a teacher is. It's teacher identity work. What does it mean to be a teacher? I'm just going to return to that because I think there requires more investment of that. At the same time, when we talk about fear and teachers being afraid because of tenure process, or I may lose my job. I don't want to push, I don't want to seem like I'm pushing back. I have not yet seen the statistics that suggest that there is not a demand for teachers. So I'm kind of concerned about a whole nation of people who are concerned about losing their jobs when we've had a teacher shortage for the last 50 years. How does that work? So we sort of have to stop and go, who really is in a position of power? Right? Now, it doesn't mean that you take that and you enact new forms of oppressive harm because like we have the power. I'm not saying that. But when people sort of learn and understand what power means, it means accountability. It doesn't mean I have the loudest voice and I have the biggest fist and I have the mightiest punch. It means you're actually more accountable and you're more responsible. So if we accept the accountability and the responsibility for the profession, and we engage in that with a sense of agency, with a sense of collective energy, there is an opportunity to have different types of dialogues rather than I'm afraid I'm going to lose my job, because every politician is voted. That's a voted in position. So fear of job doesn't really square up with the persons who have the most demand for a job. There isn't like an outsourced demand for a new politician. We're not out here going like, we really need another comptroller. We really need, like, oh my gosh, what will we do if there isn't another? but let 50% of your teaching force pause. So I think we really need to rethink afraid of what? But I was always a resistant, rabble-rousing teacher, to be clear, so my sense of teaching fearlessness was pretty high, because in my opinion, the worst thing that was going to happen was that my children were going to learn. That was the worst thing that was going to happen. And so I kind of had the sense of, what if I'm going to lose my job? And I'm like, okay, because I just go get another one in an hour, without any fear or doubt. Now, I realize people work in some conditions, some states that are looking to make martyrs out of folks. They're going out of their way looking to make martyrs out of folks, right? And that sense of like, well, just go somewhere else. Well, that's not necessarily that simple. We know that the case when you had, hundreds of thousands of African-American teachers removed from the teaching force with Brown Board of Education. You got desegregated schools, and then you have Black teachers who lost their jobs because now the profession was being owned, if you will, overwhelmingly by a white teaching force. So it's not simple to be like, oh, there's no history of afraid to lose one's job. But I think, when we talk about a system rooted in the idea of a public trust, there is a different type of responsibility. And I think it's a convenient narrative to be like, I'm so afraid. But okay.
Well, a lot of what you're saying to me has a lot of correlation to the larger societal challenges that we have to, create equitable spaces and equitable leadership in organizations, in the corporate sector, and so on and so forth. And there is a deficit in fearlessness in organizations right now in terms of how folks are responding to the political attacks that are happening on DEI and on, even just language, like just being inclusive, right, is seen as a bad thing now. People are being convinced that to be more inclusive and to be more equitable and to create more belonging is discriminatory, right? People are being convinced of that. So how can some of the lessons from the world of education and the challenges that are there correlate to what we need to do at a larger societal level?
When the United States decided to brilliantly create this concept of public education, we also created a bit of a monster with states' rights, and owning what that means in
Yes.
the state, right? And so for as
Hmm.
inventive as it was, we also created a conundrum, if you will. And so for people to have one experience in one state and another experience in another state and another experience in another state, you have people like, oh my gosh, this is where you work. Well, no wonder you think this way, or no wonder you have access to these things or you feel this way, right? And so when we talk about this social responsibility of how do we think about this at a macro level, we have to then return to understanding what political responsibility we have and political will, and understand that there are consequences for everything. And there are consequences for those folks who have misused, and I will say this, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, who have abused and who have misaligned the discourse and the language that are connected to diversity, equity, and inclusion, where requests for, or not even requests, for demands for expectation of inclusivity have worked against its very intention in the first place. And so we have to be a little bit more clear about, and this is difficult because we can't assume that everyone's speaking the same language. Some person's expectation of equity and opportunity for people to just be. Can I be? you
Right,
know,
right.
um, and that expectation has a range of things of what that is. And we can't expect everyone to line up with every single topic on every single issue. And it's unfair to suggest that people should. So one of the very unique experiences that I've been supporting and trying to help people work through, I'll say that, of what happens where you have people who are responding to topics out of trauma, that they have experienced so much trauma around a particular set of issues that their advocacy is so strong and so intense that they then become the arbiters of traumatizing someone else. And we have to know that if hurt people, then when you're advocating for diversity, when you're advocating for voice, when you're advocating for expression, that means you're advocating for everyone's voice and expression, not just yours. And so we have some extreme examples now where the trauma that some folks have felt because of their own subordination, as they are trying to advocate, they are now also silencing people that don't even agree with them. So, we don't want to be negligent and irresponsible in saying there's only one way to be an advocate. There's only one way to think at a macro level. But we do have to consider that when you talk about engaging in public education and the interests of the public and for the good of the public, those are all very subjective terms, because what I may think is for the good of the public, somebody else may not think is for the good of the public. And that's where we uniquely, in our democratic, open, ideal belief system, we created a system to say all beliefs can and people have the right to. This range of difference is okay. And so while we articulate one thing, we don't like it when people actually show up to the table trying to live out the very thing that we said was okay. And for if people are functioning and living out of fear, then they vote out of fear. And so fear mongering and leading campaigns rooted in fear and politics rooted in fear is what is driving people with their voting practices. They're voting on a ballot of fear as opposed to using other logics of inquiry as a means to think about the decision making that they have. And so we must not tread lightly, but we must be very clear about illuminating the decisions that people make. And I don't believe people are as simple as we'd like to think they are, although we have some very simpleton-like behaviors and characteristics that are helping us question what's happening. It's like, are we really that simple? We're not that simple. We're very complex, which is why these complexities seem to be so overwhelming.
So much of what you have shared today, I think, revolves back to that theme of fear. When educators are fearful, whether it is perceived or real, the risk that they're afraid of, they may hold back on speaking up and taking those actions. And then we also see it at the sort of at the leadership at the institutional level. And I know you've talked about this a lot in education. We see it with many of our clients. We'll conduct assessments, we'll gather all the data, we analyze it, and we say, here is a snapshot of the existing culture as your constituents are experiencing it. These are the areas of concern, of frustration, of pain. And inevitably, there is some level of defensiveness, deflection, moving the goalposts, right? And that is often also, yes, exactly. Just kind of move it out of the way, move it out of the way. But are we just kind of creating an issue that doesn't really exist? It's like, but we just gave you all this data. But we want to parse out this data and find a way to make it fit into our perceptions or what we would like to think our organization is like, our society is like, because the reality that is being presented through that data is scary, is uncomfortable, is requiring them to maybe hold the mirror up to themselves in a way that they've never had to before. And I also think sometimes, giving some benefit of the doubt, there is also not just a fear of looking at the reality, but also a fear of, I don't know how to address this. I don't know, or we collectively in these positions of power don't know how to fix this. And that isn't that our job to fix the problem. And when they're coming from that mentality, then I think we see a lot of this paralysis and moving of the goalposts. So all of that is to say, when you think about this notion of institutional will, Ayanna, what are some ways that you have supported people in positions of power, of authority, of leadership to push past that fear, right? That deflection, to take the data that has been gathered and take the action necessary to actually move toward progress?
And I think thank you for that, unpacking that, because there was a lot involved, particularly when you're talking about people who come to you and say, hey, help us make sense of what's happening. And I kind of ask, like, are you sure? Are you sure?
Right, exactly. You really want this? You want this?
Because you're asking me. So, sometimes people are like, I gotta tell me what you think. And I'll stop and go, are you asking me for my opinion? Or are you asking for my analysis? Okay, my opinion is just me, shooting shit, just, My analysis is then taking the data and organizing that data and engaging in acts of findings. But what has to be a little bit more clear is, what was your question? What is the question that you're asking me? Because what I heard you say in your sort of unpacking this, Maria, is sort of like, how can you help us fix the problem, right? And the question is, what's the problem? Like, I want you to name the problem, because if you are situating these issues, and I still don't know what the issues are we're talking about, so I'm just using the pronoun these, but not with unknown, right? But if you're situating these things as problems, then you're already framing what you want this data to do. You want the problem to be fixed, potentially erased, eliminated, and things to return to a framework where that thing that's being discussed as problem does not exist anymore. If you're seeking to understand why people think or people feel, then you are now opening yourself up to wanting to talk through the data itself with a little bit more clarity, right? And so we have to problematize, what exactly are you asking me? Exactly are you asking me for? Because if you suggest that engaging in these conversations, talking with organizations or working with folks, and they really want to get a better understanding of what's happening with their organization and their institution, I want to make it very clear. Is it because you want to then engage what is happening with the institution in order to support your institutional growth? Or is it because you're trying to eliminate what you think you may find? And I think as people who get contracted out or call someone context thought spectrum and say, hey, I'm really interested in working with you. You know, we're having this problem. Oh, what's the problem? You introduced it as a problem. And so I like to pull the thread out of that little rug so I can really understand what exactly are you saying, because I have the right to refuse. I'm not interested in participating you in situating this conversation as problematic. Now, if you're trying to understand more about, I wonder where this came from, or I wonder, how this arose and what we can do to engage our community so that everyone feels connected. That means we're looking for a pathway to build in forms of development and inclusivity. We're not saying it's a problem, fix it, make it stop. As opposed to how then do we become more mindful? How do we become more responsive to? How do we think about this more responsibly? And if you do, and there's nothing wrong with your organization having policies and practices that don't necessarily line up with every new trend and habit and thing that's showing up in the world, because there's a lot of stuff showing up, y'all. I mean, for real. I mean, it's a lot. It's a lot. So if you're not necessarily interested in, like, some of these things are too much, doesn't mean that I am a hateful, hurtful person, but this is not really the brand or the market or what I'm trying to do with my organization. Just own that. Own that. Don't use smoke and mirrors to try to say we're really interested in trying to grow. And then by the time you get to that moment where the findings say something, you're resistant to those very things. So I think it's okay for people to own a little bit more and not be sort of like, well, we don't want to seem like we are bigoted, or we don't want to appear that. So you don't want you want the illusion of equity and belongingness and opportunity. So what can we do to keep the illusion of this while we create repressive policies and practices that continually marginalize people? And I'm really okay with rewording those things to say it just like that. And that helps people square up a little sooner and say, oh, okay. And that allows you whether or not you want to deal, because all money ain't good money. It's okay to, and if you're looking for someone who's going to help replicate and help you continue further develop those isms, then find that group, because there's a group for you, quite frankly. I wish you wouldn't. I wish for the growth and the evolution. So I try to help leaders engage in a process of a truthful experience with me. I love being consistent. Like, the Ayanna you see on Saturday at the grocery store ought to be the same Ayanna who's going to sit side by side with you in the board meeting and unpack a difficult situation. And I try to be very, very consistent so that I don't have to question, like, did I say that? Or, how did I do that? And so when I'm trying to, diplomacy is always on the table, to be clear. Like, please be mindful of your audience. But I think for me, in working with leaders, I don't want them to feel as if they have to go through a juggernaut of pretending for us to get down to the real business of the work. And if I offer them the best and the most authentic element of who I am and the work that I'm trying to do, I think it cuts through all of the songs and dances and things that people do just out of social interaction, complexity, and allows us to get to the real root of what are we trying to do and trying to do together. And am I really the best person to support you in doing that? And I feel really good about the work that I've been able to do, because I think sometimes people take a sigh of relief and say, "Ooh, I'm so glad that I could say that it sounds terrible, I know, but I'm so glad I was able to really say what I said. And you're still going to work with me because you're committed to what the big picture is, not just to the language games we're going to play in order to convince people that we are what we don't want other people to believe we are. That was a lot of words to say that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, it was spot on, number one. And number two, I think it really demonstrated that you as an individual and your authenticity and your sincere integrity and commitment to the work and to bettering communities, all the things we talked about that are needed to be done in education and in every other area, right? It really shines through. And I think that's what we're missing in our world today, is just authentic leaders like yourself who are deeply committed to the bigger picture, and that it's not just about us, right? And so I think you've said that in a lot of great words today. So we really appreciate it. And I know we're just about out of time here, but I just wanted to say on behalf of Maria and our team, thank you for being with us. It's always a joy when you and I get together, and I'm so grateful for your time. I know we could have gone on for a lot longer, but I just wanted to also just mention that Dr. Ayanna Brown is working in a lot of multifaceted ways in higher education, through consulting, through research. So you can find a lot of her information online, and we'll definitely share more of that in the show notes. But Dr. Ayanna Brown, thank you for being with us today, my friend, and we will talk soon.
You are very welcome. Thank you for having me. Enjoy and stay true.
Thank you for listening to Culture Stew. In a world full of podcasts, we are so grateful that you chose to spend time with us today.
Culture Stew is produced by MSM Global Consulting and hosted by me, Maria Morukian.
And me, Roger Moreano.
Are you interested in learning more about Culture Stew and MSM Global Consulting? Sign up for the Culture Stew newsletter at www.msmglobalconsulting.com and send us your stories or your questions at culturestew@msmglobalconsulting.com.
And remember to please give us a 5-star rating and review on your podcast platform.
See you next time.